And our final act of the week, dear committee, is we are going to hear from the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Agency of Transportation about sort of big picture on their budget and their budget proposals related to their fund balance. And then a very specific fee that they're looking for. So we're going to start big picture and then go down into that smaller fee. And so Commissioner Manoli, I believe you are kicking us off in this conversation.
So good afternoon again, Wanda Manoli, Commissioner of DMV, for the record. I have not, I apologize, I have not put a presentation together. I understood we were going to try to talk about the IIJA funds, which was going to be led by the Agency of Transportation. And then we were going to talk about the mileage-based user fee program. Patrick was going to lead that discussion. But if you have any specific questions about my budget that you have now, I'm more than happy to answer those questions. Otherwise, I'd like to be able to, Madam Chair, turn it over to the agency.
That sounds great. Thank you. No, I don't think we have any specific questions.
Okay, thank you.
And so is Mr. Kuchenberg?
You got it.
Mr. Kuchenberger, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Of course. So I have a presentation due. Should I join on Zoom and then share that?
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Great.
And it's the funding IIJA state match.
That's right. So while I get this pulled up, I submitted a few items for this topic. One is a presentation, one is that details kind of the thought process or methodology for the governor's proposed FY24 budget and reserving some of those funds for transportation investment in the future fiscal years. And then demonstrating what the impact would be of not funding those projects. And there's lists of projects and a map associated with that. But I will run through all of that for you in a moment. For the record, I'm Bradley Kuchenberger, Chief Financial Officer for the Agency of Transportation, and it's really nice to be here with all of you. Thanks for asking me to come in. Just about connected.
Okay.
I avoided a horrible echo somehow. That was good.
Great, thank you. And I can see it on the screen. Oh.
It's working.
Okay, great. We just have to be patient.
Computer.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, so when we were preparing the agency budget, which for the Agency of Transportation involves building a capital program for all the projects that we're going to take on in the upcoming budget year, plus the following 3 budget years, as an example. And so while we were preparing that, the governor's office asked us to do an analysis of a state fund budget gap that we had relative to the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure laws. It's was passed a couple of years ago, and we're seeing a historical amount of funding for transportation projects available. And we knew upon the passage of that 5-year infrastructure bill that there would be some pressures on state funds to fully match and make use of all of those investments accordingly. But as we're working through that federal legislation and learning more about it and getting into those details, we are able to really narrow in on exactly what we think we would need in the future years. So we came up with a list of projects that would be an investment of $79 million of state funds, which the governor's office chose to use general fund surplus in order to cover the match for these federal projects, which I'll go through. It's on the screen.
And the actual nature of the projects is much more the purview of the transportation committee.
I'll try to keep it just high level about the funding scheme and the overall impact. So when we were asked to come up with an analysis of what our state fund gap is really to match all the federal funds available to us between FY24 and 26, we came up with a number of 79 million, which in a federal share is worth 341.5 million for a total project investment using 79 million additional state funds outside of the current law transportation fund revenues that we use now, would have an investment of a total project cost of about 420 million. Now these come from a few areas in the large federal bill. There's the core programs that we use and we have funding for pretty much every year, and we can count on them and we know. And then there's a portion of the bill that had some competitive or discretionary grants, which we thought we could pursue with additional federal state investment to go after these monies. So as we've been discussing this with the various legislative committees, we took the inverse. We built our capital program with this 79 million of general fund included, and all of the projects associated with those, which would be a value of 10.9 million in fiscal year 24 and a remaining $68 million of general fund investment in fiscal year 25 and 26. And our 4-year capital program is reflective of those investments. We then thought about what if we took away those $79 million investments, what would that do? And the way that the construction projects work and the way they're planned and programmed for expenditure over the course of fiscal years, if you delay a project from, let's say, fiscal year 24 to 25, while also having a budgetary gap in 25 that you're suggesting. And then you're going to have to delay more projects in 25 to 26 and so on. So we have what's called this cascade effect. And we think the overall impact of this $79 million that we've been discussing, really, if we were to remove that from our capital plan over the next 4 years, would result in a total all funds project scope of around $655.5 million. Really, another point to mention is in general practice for large cities. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, could you repeat what you said you'd remove from the
yeah, so all told, if we look at all the projects that would be impacted over those course of years, the value of those projects would be around $655.5 million.
So when you get down to, so good, thank you.
Cool. Really the most cost-effective time to begin a large-scale construction project, which is what we at the agency do, is the present moment. There are significant inflationary factors at play, and particularly in the construction sector, that seem likely to persist over time. And any project we delay today or lack of funds would likely or almost guaranteed to be costing more in the future. So that was the kind of value of the projects that we would think would be impacted. There's a number of projects, and we wanted to give you what types of projects. So it would impact around 223 projects. For context, I believe our 4-year capital program involves like 800 some projects. So about a quarter of the projects would be impacted over the programs as listed. And these projects themselves are detailed in a document that we also submitted, which I'll show you in a moment. I'd like to take a moment to make a pitch and show an example of, I might just pull it up in my browser. But the agency does have a really cool website called V-Transparency, where you can log on and see all the different projects that are at play or in plan for your districts, and it's very interactive. It's a really good piece of public information. So before we move on to making sure you understand any of the lists of the project impacts that we suggest, we put together a list of what we consider at the agency to be the funding options for this bucket of funds, or for the agency in general. When we talk about this 79 million, the first option, which is one that I hear advocating for, is the acceptance of the governor's recommended proposal in FY24, which is to fund AOT with $10.9 million of a transfer from the general fund to the transportation fund in fiscal 24. And then in the D sections of the language, it does have a reserve for project match in fiscal 25 and 26, the balance of which is about $68.1 million. If you were to look beyond general fund investment and using that surplus to transfer into the transportation fund, or option number 2 would involve allowing the agency transportation fund to use all of the revenues, or more of a share of the revenues that the transportation modes generate for agency initiatives. And I believe you've received testimony, at least in some portion, about the transportation or the JTOC appropriation to public safety that comes out of the transportation fund to the public safety program each year. And then there is 1/3 of the motor vehicle purchase and use tax that goes to the education fund each year, which has a value of approximately $50 million.
So I appreciate or understand why you would have a desire to bring that all in-house with you.
Yeah.
I've seen sort of the slide deck from when you presented it over there, and it sounds to me when I read it like the administration is proposing raising property taxes. Like, that's how I read it. Because when we take money out of the education fund, that's what it does. Because we can't spend less there. Like, we have to spend what we spend. And so
These are, the
and I don't even
administration is,
like, I don't understand what's being proposed.
no, the administration's really just proposing it. We're going to jump down to number 5. The administration's proposing that, and has made clear that they would not approve any tax or fee increase. So that would be the DMV fees or the fuel taxes on transportation funding, unless or until those other items are made whole into the transportation fund.
Okay, so that seems like a reasonable thing to ask. The administration would approve the taxes or fee increases on the DMV fees. And the administration.
Only at such time.
Yes, no, I understand. And so I'm going to build out the whole
Sure,
scenario.
yeah.
Okay. And then also approve the transfer of the purchase and use tax. Would then the administration be approving whatever additional revenue we put into the education fund to cover it?
I'm not able to answer that right now.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can someone at some point answer it? I totally understand you can't, but it's kind of a big part of the proposal because it's either property taxes go up or we find additional revenue for the education fund. It's not that we can spend, like, and I don't mean that.
Oh, no, I don't.
Really, like that's how the education fund works.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
No, I think I totally understand your question and
Okay.
I'm gonna try to get back to you as best I can.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
The other options that that I've listed out here are transportation infrastructure bonding. That is a mechanism by which we have our own transportation infrastructure bond fund, which is a revenue source for this particular type of bond. The caveat I would add, thinking of that as a revenue source for AOT projects is the inflationary situation in the economy that we see. So that money is particularly expensive compared to what it would be in pretty much any other time period.
So are you recommending that?
No, we're not recommending that. This is really just a list of
Things you don't recommend?
things that we just have that are out there as an
Okay.
option.
Great.
And I was trying to clarify the administrations and agencies' position on these items.
I agree on that.
Yeah, okay. So I think unless there's other questions, I'd be happy to move on to some of the other documents I provided just to make sure you understand them.
Yeah, we have one question.
One of the things that I've been contemplating is because this is so many projects tied to this particular funding conundrum, assuming that we fund $79 million to get that match, do we feel confident that we have the resources to execute those projects, given where we are with the workforce challenges?
Absolutely.
That's so reassuring. Thanks. I haven't heard anyone say that about workforce in a long time.
I am.
It's great.
I was expecting more words.
Yeah, we've been, our project delivery record over the last few years has been remarkable and I think is really only getting better. So yeah, I would not hesitate to say absolutely to that.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to make sure I went through the list of items.
Sounds like we should build a new computer for you into this budget that we're discussing.
It's been through a lot. It's really a war horse, but it might be at its last leg. Okay, hold on.
Which is outside the purview of this committee, just in case anyone was getting excited for a minute.
Oh. So I'm just gonna run through to demonstrate the list of project impact that I shared with the committee. It's on the committee page, so that you can review it at your own leisure. But if we were to delay projects or have reduced funding in the amount, the $79 million we're talking about, we have a list of projects that would be impacted. So they're listed by county on the left, particular program. So this is the agency type of program. Some of them can sound similar, but the real project description and the route number is probably the most helpful if you wanted to review your own constituency groups areas. And I would just say that at the last page, there's more kind of statewide or less specified projects that are in the program areas of the rail, aviation, and public transit facility. And then I also provided a map of this list of projects that could be affected in the event of not having those funds available to do those that you can peruse at your own leisure.
So we want to make sure we have those funds available.
Absolutely. And
I find that I often make a lot of policy decisions based on Addison and Bennington counties. I rarely get to my own county of Wyndham.
it's a large list, but the methodology to put it together is sound. So if you do have any questions or thoughts about anything I presented today or want to know more, or if I can get back to you on some of that other information you asked me about, I'd be happy to.
I'm sorry to put you in that position. I imagine if that answer was above your pay grade there.
It's outside of the scope of the agency.
Absolutely.
So I would have to confer with our other partners in.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Anyone? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Director Boomhauer, you're taking us through our next,
Actually,
No.
no, I'm gonna
Okay.
have my colleague, Patrick Murphy. who
Okay, great.
has been the project manager for this, and we also, of course, have Commissioner Manoli on,
okay, great,
board too.
thank you. Mr. Murphy, welcome. Glad to see you.
Thank you. For the record, Patrick Murphy, Vermont Agency of Transportation. Thanks for your invitation to be here this afternoon. I understand we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try and be as quick as I can here and allow for some questions at the end. If you do have any questions about a specific slide, feel free to jump in. So I'm sure all of you are aware of the impact that the increasing fuel efficiency of the statewide fleet has had on fuel tax revenue for the state, the transportation fund. But I'm here today to speak specifically to the impacts that we expect to see from electrification of the transportation sector, particularly with light-duty passenger vehicles. And so for some context about where we are right now in terms of EV adoption, we have about 8,900 vehicles registered here in the state. Just over half of those are plug-in electric vehicles or fully electric vehicles, and just underneath half plug-in hybrids. So this gives you a sense of what our goals are for the Climate Action Plan. In just a few years, we're hoping to meet, this is modeling that was done out of the Climate Action Plan to determine what are the vehicle targets that we might need to meet in order to meet the greenhouse gas reduction emissions targets that we have. So 27,000 vehicles, we're just about a third of the way there. And need to make up the ground in the next couple of years. But there are a number of things at play that point in that direction. So Vermont, just at the end of last year, adopted the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which is the California regulations that requires in model year 2026 that automakers deliver certain percentages of vehicles to the state. And so this maps out what those required percentages are. There are a number of rules around it that allow for automakers to comply in different ways, but there is the expectation that we will get close to those levels of vehicles that we're hoping to achieve because of this kind of regulation, which will deliver the vehicles to the state. It doesn't mean that those will be purchased necessarily, but the state and the agency is working to make sure that those are available to households, particularly of low and moderate incomes. So when we first began to look at what the potential losses might be in the fall of 2021 with a consultant, these charts were kind of the estimates that we had, just to give you a sense of the scale of things. They're based on a variety of EV adoption scenarios. And so when you're looking at the previous slide and what the vehicle targets are that we need for the climate action plan, this higher adoption scenario is probably the closest. So even if we don't meet those goals, you can see that we still start to really lose money in the long term on an annual basis. This is looking at it in a different way. So looking at what the agency's proposal is for a mileage-based user fee for all electric vehicles and an additional registration fee for plug-in hybrids. So it's looking at those targets within the climate action modeling and then applying that potential policy to what we expect to achieve. And so that gives you some sense of what we might miss out on if we don't move in this direction. So to the right, you see expected revenue that would come from this kind of policy. We haven't set any kind of a fee, but in the work that was done over the past year and a half or so, it was determined that somewhere around 1.3 cents per mile made sense to maintain revenue neutrality with the average gas vehicle across Vermont. This is
Go
sure.
back. So you said that at some point in the last few years, that number was hit upon as that fee rate?
Oh, the what the rate might be?
Yeah.
So there was a study, and that's included in what was submitted for the committee.
Tell me a little bit more about how it was.
So it's basically calculated by using the average vehicle gas mileage per gallon, and the average number of miles traveled per year. So about 12,000 was used as a figure, and then working back into how much that represents on a per mile basis.
Of gas tax?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not meant to achieve any more or any less revenue than if all vehicles were powered by gas
That makes sense.
and paying the same. And so also to be clear, this is just referring to the state gas tax. It doesn't include the 18.4 cents of the federal tax. So this is a recent study from just this past month that looked at when electric vehicles are expected to reach price parity with their gasoline counterparts. And so this is a key question because one of the arguments that comes up when talking about a mileage-based user fee or any kind of road usage charge for an electric vehicle is just that the vehicle owners are already paying more in terms of purchase and use tax because the cost of those vehicles is higher. And so they are in that way contributing more to the transportation fund. But that is not expected to continue. So here it shows that price parity might be reached around 27 to 2028. But when the Inflation Reduction Act is factored in, which provides more tax credits for folks, for many folks across the country, and in 2024, those will be refundable at the point of sale, so that the actual vehicle price will be reduced by those amount of credits that are available for eligible vehicles. That then pushes the point at which it's expected that electric vehicles reach price parity with gasoline-powered vehicles. And so that's in somewhere between the 2023 to 2025 timeframe. And this doesn't take into account all of the other vehicle incentive programs that the legislature has approved over the past few years.
So are you seeing a decrease in price of vehicles, an absolute decrease in like going from 40,000 to 30,000 in 1 year?
There is not, vehicle prices have been rising, so that has not been the trend. And there have been all kinds of supply issues over the past couple of years related to microchips that are critical to the manufacture of these vehicles, and supply chain issues generally that have limited the availability and increased the cost of both new and used vehicles. That is not expected to continue, and instead, the cost of batteries that go into the vehicles is expected to gradually decline, and that's what accounts for this decrease. I've set the arrow here at 2025 because I don't personally believe that we're going to see price parity this year. I think because of the way that the Inflation Reduction Act is structured, more people will be able to take advantage of this program in 2024 and in future years when automakers have actually been able to catch up and meet the requirements in that act around battery components and critical minerals. So it's it will be some time, but it is expected to decline at some rate. And so we think that, generally around the time that we would expect to implement some kind of a mileage-based user fee program, that we're not going to see additional contributions to the transportation fund through the purchase and use tax on electric vehicles.
Okay.
So very quickly, road usage charge. We evaluated a number of different scenarios. The road usage charge study committee, there was an advisory committee that was made up of a number of different agencies and stakeholders, looked at mileage-based user fee. In many states there are flat fees, which is an attempt to approximate a sort of road usage charge per kilowatt hour fee that would be applied at the point of charging. And then the gas tax itself is a road usage charge that has become less and less reflective of the actual impact of vehicles upon the road as vehicle efficiencies have shifted over the past several decades. So the intention is with the mileage-based user fee to get more at what is the true impact of any given vehicle upon the road network. This is a few of the places where states are exploring this kind of program. Only 3 have been enacted, and all of these are mostly voluntary. They're Utah and Oregon, for example, have flat fees and then allow you to opt into a mileage-based user fee so that you don't have to pay that flat fee. But there's no state yet that has required enrollment in a mileage-based user fee for electric vehicles.
You said there's no state that, say that again?
There's no state where there's an actual requirement that vehicles be enrolled in a mileage-based user fee.
So the enacted programs are optional?
The enacted programs are mostly voluntary.
And why would someone opt into them?
In order to pay less of a fee. So if your flat fee is set at a rate that doesn't reflect what the actual miles are that you trap, then you would likely opt into it. And so that also then has limitations in terms of what it's able to produce for revenue for the transportation fund. Many more states have just implemented flat fees and build it mostly as part of the vehicle registration process. That has drawbacks as well, that we explored in the, lack of fairness around what the actual impacts of vehicles are upon the road, but also in terms of how people experience that fee as a sort of one-time upfront cost versus how people right now experience gas taxes on more of a pay-as-you-go basis. So the road usage charge study back in the fall of 2021 considered all of these different scenarios, thinking about how best to develop this sustainable revenue source to maintain our roads and bridges and the entire transportation system, and how fair any future funding sources might be for the drivers that are using the network. And that we took the approach that any funding mechanism must be aligned with the climate action plan. And so there's some language in the climate action plan that no system should be introduced until we reach 15% of new vehicle sales. And that's what we expect the 2020 timeframe is will be in excess of that threshold, but also that it reflects other climate action goals. So, a mileage-based user fee does encourage more efficient use of the road network as well.
I appreciate that we didn't want to prevent early adopters from early adopting. And I think if we wait too long on something like this, it becomes much, much, much harder to get across the finish line. And so I'm really glad that you all are coming in this year to discuss this.
Yeah, and it will take some planning as well. We'll get to it in a couple of slides. There are details around this that need to be worked out, and so we'll have to take the next year and a half to be able to do that. But the Road Usage Charge Advisory Committee did find in its final report that this was the best opportunity to align those revenue and climate goals, that it cost effectively would use our existing system. So through the vehicle inspection process, odometer readings are already captured. And so it's a matter of then working to be able to transfer that data to some sort of account manager that can then assign the rate and be able to bill in that way. We wanted to look at flexible payment options. There wasn't this big upfront cost to folks, and that you might be able to have the option of selecting a different frequency of payment. We touched on the issue of fairness. There were also concerns about privacy in a more technological heavy approach where you might use the telematics within a vehicle, or you might require some kind of onboard device that you plug in. There have been those kinds of systems that have been trialed in other states, but they are more costly to set up. They're more costly to the folks that would be enrolling in them, and probably more costly to maintain and operate over the long term. So this also avoids the issue of the privacy concerns about the state tracking where people are going. There are other, drawbacks to that. No system is perfect, but we feel that.
But thank you very much anyway.
We feel that that is one thing that we can. So the last point I would just make is that in the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act, there is money available for the state to be able to design and implement such a system. In prior years, it was not economic for us to do so because the match was very different. It was a 50-50 state federal match. And we were not in a place to begin thinking about it at any rate. But it is now an 80-20 match for those states who are applying for the first time. So we think it's a good opportunity to be able to get this up and running, as the chair mentioned, before it has a wider impact on the vehicle fleet, and to do it in a way that allows the revenue to be captured in a few years, and provide that sustainable revenue source. So this is our just a snapshot of the proposed language. I can certainly share the full language that we've presented to the House Transportation Committee. But it is, first of all, to design and implement a process to collect a miles-based user fee for all electric vehicles. And then to also use existing language for an additional registration fee that is 1 3/4 times the standard fee, which is $76. So there is language currently in statute that defines vehicles that use other specialized fuels as vehicles that just basically don't use gas or diesel. And so the proposal is to define plug-in hybrid electric vehicles as part of that group, and then be able to, through that, assess a slightly higher registration fee. So work out to $57 per year. The difficulty with plug-in hybrid vehicles is that you could try and implement a mileage-based user fee, but through a manual process, and even through potentially an automated process, you wouldn't know necessarily how many of those were electric. So there's the potential for double taxation there. And so that's why we thought it's just as well and easier to implement something that was slightly less than what the average plug-in hybrid might travel in Vermont. So that's the gist of the proposal. What that works out to be in terms of what costs people might expect in a given year. If we had a 1.3 cent per mile.
Is that at the very bottom of your slide, the last bullet point, is that essentially the formula that matches the legislative language that you shared on the last slide?
It is, yes.
That's great, because I was going to ask Chris to make that formula for me, because it would have been so much easier for me to get my head around. Thank you. Okay, back to your presentation.
So $76 for just the general registration, and that's the 57 is the incremental cost. So you're welcome, Chris.
Madam Chair, if I could just add, you saw me talk about the registration fee being $74. The $2 discrepancy between my slides and Patrick's is due to the clean air fee that gets stacked on. So I did not, in the charts you all saw, did not adjust the $2.
Thank you.
So that applies to plug-in hybrids, but not to all electric vehicles.
I think Representative Maslin is that? Nope, that's just you holding your hand. Okay, great. Okay. Sorry, back to you.
Sure.
Excuse the confusion on my part.
No problem. So when you work your way backwards from, roughly between 30 and 33 cents for the state gas tax, and then you work your way back into the 1.3 cents per mile figure, that equates to about $156 per year. It's not necessarily that's what the rate would be. There needs to be more work to figure that out. But this is just giving you a sense of what it might cost. And again, the intention of the agency is to make sure that there are flexible payment options so that people would be able to pay more on an as-go basis if that's what the driver needed to do, the vehicle owner.
And then,
And then there was survey work done as part of the road usage study that looked at what would be the reaction to these kinds of possibilities, and the mileage-based user fee had the highest level of support because people did feel that it was fair. So about 60%, I think, felt that it was the fairer option.
Representative Sims?
So again, just to understand the payment plan, so this would be an additional $57 annually that a EV driver would have to, and so I could set up a payment plan for $57 to spread that out over the year?
That may be a possibility. We're not quite sure about how we spread out that cost. It is not as sort of large for the plug-in hybrids as it is the mileage-based user fee for the electric vehicles, but that's something that we have to explore. What could our system support?
Seems like that might be a lot of administration and staff to set up to spread out, but pretty modest.
Yeah, and so it's not necessarily the case that that's what we would do. I mean, I think we're trying to be as fair as possible, but also cost effective as possible, which is why we're using existing systems like the vehicle inspection rather than this kind of more technology heavy approach.
I have another question about that slide.
Sure.
So the 0.013 per mile, and then that double dash, is that an approximate to $150 a year?
Yes, yeah,
Okay, rather than using the,
yeah. It's actually just, yeah.
okay. But it would depend on whatever. And then the idea of the flat fee that others, so you have the mileage-based user fee for the electric vehicles and the possibility of the flat fee for the hybrids, but are you talking at all about a possible flat fee for the electrics as well?
No, there are.
Because you said that most other states have that as an
Right,
option.
so that's not something that we've proposed.
Why?
For fairness, for the reason that it wouldn't necessarily be reflective of the impact of a vehicle upon the road network. There's been some research done that looked at what is the both geographic and socioeconomic impact on households throughout Vermont, and the mileage-based user fee scores much better on that than a flat fee would, because you would have people in more rural areas in lower income brackets that would end up paying more.
I guess I was curious about how other states let you choose one or the other.
Because they're starting off with a flat fee, and that's like not negotiable. And so then they're saying, well, you can opt into this mileage-based user fee system if you don't want to pay the flat fee. And
You're just jumping ahead of that decision point.
And so what they've found as a challenge there is just Utah, for example, capped the amount that could be raised if you're opting into the mileage-based user fee. So you're actually just limiting the revenue that you're able to generate. So you're not in fact keeping constant with what you'd see if all vehicles were gas powered.
Mm.
You wouldn't quite be seeing that revenue neutrality.
I guess I was thinking about the idea that we've talked so much about how folks in rural areas, while they might pay less in housing costs because their housing is less, they're paying a lot more in transportation costs because they're driving a lot further. And that this might, in some ways, the option of a flat fee might close a little bit of a rural urban divide. Did I just totally take your point?
I had an additional point.
Great.
No, I'm glad not to be the only one having to say it.
Yes. But I've never, like, I've thought about this very little, so I'm just like riffing off of your very carefully researched research, which is totally obnoxious, so I'm sorry about that. Representative Sims, did you have something? And then Andrews and then Beck. Well, Sims first, I think.
Okay, sure, that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
Well, since you were bringing up the rural issue, I was going to bring up the border issue. And I wonder if there are any considerations around equity for those who maybe do most of their driving in Massachusetts. And so not actually doing a lot of wear and tear on our roads, but still paying maybe a fee based on miles driven that aren't, and in that scenario, they might be filling their tank up in that other state and so contributing to their transportation fund.
Yeah, and that's what I was referring to earlier with there being drawbacks to any kind of system that it's not perfect. With a gasoline vehicle now, you could be paying most of your money to a border state, but driving mostly in Vermont or vice versa. In that scenario, you're still not paying the federal gas tax. So you're having an impact on some road system, whether it's Vermont or a neighboring state. And so really, it's one of those questions that is going to be difficult to solve by any one state, and that's going to require a national solution. And if people want to have exactly the amount of miles traveled in one state be reflected in what they pay, then it would move towards more of a technological solution. It would require, in what people might perceive as an invasion of privacy, and then there would need to be a higher cost system put in place, or we would need to join whatever was developed at the federal level to deal with that. But in the absence of that, we can only sort of move forward with what we think is the best fit at this moment. And so that's where we've landed.
Representative Andrews and then Beck and then Odie.
So I'm kind of stuck thinking about the content back on slide 6.
Sure.
On the left, when you have the projected EV adoption rate and battery, almost all of that curve is representing battery electric, and the plug-in hybrid piece is like a tiny little sliver on the top that seems to be very static.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what I'm wondering about is, does it make sense to create a whole separate system of payment for those 9,000 vehicles every year?
Yeah, so it's a good point. This is data that was used to model the EV adoption scenarios for the Climate Action Plan.
Yeah.
And in that model, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles do not play a significant role. And I'm not sure that we quite agree with that because at this moment we have about 4,000 plug-in hybrids. And that might exceed the total number that you see there in 2035. In Vermont, where we have different climate conditions and terrain, it might be more likely that we see more plug-in hybrid EV adoption than other states, and that at least in the interim, that we'll see that to continue. If you then look at some of the slides around price parity, though, plug-in hybrids without the Inflation Reduction Act don't ever achieve price parity with gasoline-powered vehicles, and so they're really a transitionary vehicle that we don't expect to see play into the longer-term future. So it may be that plug-in hybrids make up a higher amount in these next few years, but a lot of investment on the part of private industry is into fully electric vehicles, and so that's where we expect things to play out.
Did you consider completely removing the gasoline tax and moving everyone to a mileage base?
We had a very narrow scope that was looking just at the issue of electrification. But as you look at the climate action plan and our targets, we have a target of basically 100% new vehicle sales by 2035. And
Vermont drives older vehicles than like anywhere else in the country though, right? So it'll take us like a bajillion years to get all of our.
well, so it will take, hopefully not that long. But it will take some time. And, but, you know, the understanding is that we're basically at some point going to get to the point where electric vehicles make up the vast majority of our fleet.
Did you?
I do, yeah. Can you go back to slide 6, Patrick?
Sure. Is this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. I
Okay.
have 2 questions.
Sure.
So this is all based on current law, state and federal tax incentives. There's no hypothetical carbon pricing or anything in here. This is just what we expect to happen with the carrots and the technology that's projected to be available the next.
This is based on the modeling that was done for the climate action plan. That these are the targets that we need to meet in order to
Okay.
achieve the greenhouse gas emissions.
So those are
reductions.
targets, not
Those are
necessarily
targets, right?
what we expect to happen. Okay.
Right.
All right, great.
Um,
And then my second question, what was my second question? Regarding the chair's question about rural and.
Sure.
Does DMV, you know how many miles cars drive when they, what does the data show? Are people in rural counties driving more miles than people that live in less rural counties? I don't want to say urban in Vermont, but.
Sure. Yeah, no, it varies by income. So, lower income households tend generally to have fewer vehicles. And having fewer vehicles is a good predictor of traveling fewer miles. But when you look at kind of what is the current conditions now, you have a situation where a lot of vehicles are actually more fuel intensive in rural areas.
Okay.
So so you tend to be larger vehicles and they tend to be vehicles that are paying more in the gas tax right now. So actually, when you look at the transition to electric vehicles, a mileage-based user fee system begins to pencil out better for more rural areas than would, we won't say urban, but.
Yeah, but does your average car in my county, Caledonia County, does the average car in Caledonia County do more miles get put on it in a given year than say Chittenden County?
Sure, I mean, there's certainly.
So there's data
There's land use patterns naturally contribute to how much someone drives.
Okay.
Representatives. Oh, sorry, I think were you next? Yeah, sorry.
So I would like to know how miles per gallon gas equates to electric vehicles and also efficiency in highway driving or less stop and go driving compares to very stop and go driving. Because I'm looking at this, you lower your gas mileage by 15 to 30% at highway speeds and 10 to 40% in stop and go traffic. So MPG is higher on highways and routes compared to city driving, because city driving necessitates slower speeds, idling, and higher revolutions per minute. So how does that work with an electric car? Just, do you use more electricity with an electric car or less? And also number of miles what does that mean if you're using more gas up, if you're stopping and going versus nicely going on without stopping and going?
So when you're in a gasoline powered vehicle, when you're stopping and then having to start, that takes an initial burst of energy, right? And so that's why it's not as efficient if you're kind of in one speed going along the highway. Now, observing speed limits, right?
Right.
In an electric vehicle, when you're braking, you're actually, in many cases, regenerating some of the electricity into the battery. And so they just work differently.
Braking gives you more battery power?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean.
Right about that before, but, okay, yeah.
But so to your, I think, second question about I think it speaks to the fact that the gas tax is not necessarily the best indicator of road, miles traveled, and the impact upon the road system. And so that's why we're proposing something that more accurately reflects that impact.
Representative Sims, and then we're gonna get back to the presentation.
So sort of building on Representative Beck's sort of question about transportation in rural communities. I mean, I went back and found one statistic that I remembered because it really stuck with me when I learned it, and that in Essex County, our highest poverty, most rural region, 80% of the workforce leaves the county for work every day. And so, maybe the number of cars you own is a measure of how you drive, but also, recognizing some of our places, many workers have to travel significant distances to work. So I'd almost be interested in hearing a little bit more from maybe some folks who really understand transportation data in our state and impact on rural and less rural Vermonters as we think about what is a pretty significant shift, and certainly understand that paying for the roads based on how much you use them is important, and also just want to think about disproportionate, like the impacts, especially on our high poverty Vermonters who may have to drive out of the county that they live in to find work.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen some really cool labor shed maps around the state. Very fun. So back to you and your presentation.
So just to touch on that a bit, a big part of the state's push towards electrification, not just to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reductions that we hope for, but it's also to be able to make transportation more affordable for folks. And so when you look at what is the cost of a mileage-based user fee on an annual basis, estimated at somewhere around $150 versus what it costs to own and operate an electric vehicle over that same year, it's just a fraction. So almost $1,000 when you look at fuel savings, maintenance savings, and you're continuing still to not pay federal taxes on that. That may change, that might shift. So over the 5-year period of ownership, you're paying maybe $780 in a state mileage-based user fee. $485 is avoided in federal taxes, and almost $5,000 is saved. And there is that high cost barrier to EV ownership at the moment, and that's where other incentive programming comes into play to make sure that folks, in addition to the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, that people are able to get deeper affordability there, both in terms of used and new vehicles. So very quickly to wrap up, we're looking at over the next year how such a system would be implemented, what are those long-term operational staffing costs, what the system design will look like, how enforcement mechanisms are built onto using existing statute and practices, how rates setting will be developed and potentially some rulemaking elements. And then how this sort of program would be transitioned. And so we have a federal grant application that we plan to submit to US DOT. The notice of funding opportunity has not yet been announced, but should be coming soon. And I said this earlier, that it comes with an 80%, 20% federal state cost share. So we would be looking at a $3.5 million request. And half of that is proposed, half of the state match is proposed in this year's budget and half in the next year's. So this gives you just a sense of the timeline that we're looking at, that hopefully in the next month, we'll see the notice of funding opportunity released. We'll submit within probably a 60-day window. It remains to be seen how quickly then we'll hear back on whether there's been an award. But we do have in the legislation that we've proposed a report that we'd come back to the legislature in about this time next year.
If you don't get the, sorry to interrupt, but if you don't get the grant, would you still be able to prepare to follow through on any sort of future fee setting that we put in place this year?
I think that's a part of the reason why we're starting now. I mean, if we happen to be unsuccessul in our grant application, then we would have another crack at it the year after that. But it is a significant amount of money to try and design and implement a model-based user thesis, and even though it's more cost-effective and less than a more technological solution.
Okay, thanks.
So that's what I have for the presentation, and I'm happy to kind of dive into any more questions you might have or follow up with more data if that's.
Representative Bodie?
Thank you. I suppose, since I didn't hear about it, but are there any states or is there anyone who does something about income and looks at people's income and just says, if you're at a certain income, we're not going to collect from you?
I haven't seen any states that tie their road usage charge to an income or that are income sensitive. It's not to say that it couldn't be done. It's just I have not seen that as a model, and it's of course not what we have for the existing gas tax.
Right, that's definitely true.
I'll just make the comment. I'm astonished that for all the roads we get to drive on in Vermont, we only pay on average $150 to the state for that. I mean,
Seems like a pretty good
this seems like it ought to be a lot more.
Yeah,
Anyhow.
Well, I mean, we do
the federal on top of it.
we also pay all of those fees
Yeah.
that we just went through that fund the road, but it is remarkable. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
And Scott reminded me, while you have built in for the moment in an electric environment the saving of the federal portion of the gas tax, I have to believe that that's not a perpetual savings.
Sure.
We just don't know when Congress will finally face our reality.
Right.
And then hopefully we will be far enough along that it won't set us back, so to say.
Yeah, and in fact, we would have systems in place that allow us to better take advantage of whatever the federal solution might be.
Well, thank you very much to everyone on the team that came in today. Really appreciate it. I know that the committee next door is working on the language and just wanted to make sure that we were prepared for when it came over to us. So I imagine we'll spend a little bit more time together in the next few weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.
And we are all going to finish committee for the week, though I imagine none of us are finishing our work for the week, and see you back here on Tuesday after the floor, after caucuses, but please check the agenda on Monday or over the weekend, and Source will probably be sending out some prep documents for more bills that will help coming up.